My paper was called Maracana and the Contemporary Moment. It was an attempt to draw out some lessons about the Maracana massacre and what it means for post-apartheid politics. What the paper really concentrates on is the fractures in the social and political structure that were shown up by the Maracana massacre. On the one hand, you have a corporatist system of labor relations, which depends on unions being representative. But the whole problem with Maracana is that all of the unions at the Lonmin shaft were not representative. In fact, many of the strikers, were not members of any union at all. And the Maracana strike was really about objecting to the ways in which labor relations structures dissipate and channel dissent. And the Maracana strike was really a rejection of that. The fact that the response to that was that the miners were essentially executed when the police moved into the tactical phase of their operations, or what they called the tactical phase of their operations, throws up all sorts of other questions about the costs of dissent in post-apartheid South Africa. What does it mean to participate? What does it mean to dissent? And I spoke about a range of other organizations that have been met with state repression by dissenting outside the accepted institutions of participation and labor relations. So, for example, Abahlali Basiamjondolo, which is a shack dwellers movement in Durban, very often refuses to participate in ward committee structures which are loaded against it, and finds itself, when it goes outside those structures and embarks on public protest or land occupations, finds itself the victim of political assassinations, the victim of punitive evictions, the victim of police violence and unlawful detention. And I was trying to draw a parallel between what Abahlali has to put up with when it says, well, this system is loaded, we're going to dissent against it, it's loaded against us, we're going to dissent against it, we're going to take to the streets. And what happened to the miners when they said, well, we're not satisfied with the way we're represented, we're going to go outside the labor relations system and we're going to negotiate directly with Lonmin. One of the aspects of the strike which is little commented on is that the strikers parked themselves for 4 days on a hill and said they would disperse if Lonmin came to negotiate with them directly. So that attempt to appeal directly to Lonmin outside the established structures was the miners' biggest negotiating point, their biggest demand, the most important strategy that they deployed. And it was also the strategy that ultimately ended in the violence, because the police were the state and the police were so threatened by this rejection of the systems and the structures meant to dissipate the strikers' agency and to absorb their dissent, that the response was extremely securocratic. It was extremely violent. Ultimately, of course, history didn't stop at the Maracana massacre, and ultimately, of course, that strategy worked. It cost 34 people their lives, 44 people their lives, in fact. But the strategy worked. The strike carried on, and the miners got something closer to their demands. Interestingly, what happened after the end of the strike was that another union, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, moved into the space where the existing collective bargaining relationships and the National Union of Mine Workers had AMCU moved into the space that they'd retreated from. And of course, there was a funny sort of business as usual re-established after the miners' strike. But the nature of the entity representing the striking workers changed. So it's interesting to consider to what extent the Maracana massacre called out existing labor relations structures, and to what extent it ultimately ended up reinforcing them by simply changing the majority union at Lonmin. Other themes I touched on were inequality. the massive inequality that we have in South Africa. We're the most unequal society in the world. Although absolute poverty has reduced since 1994, inequality has increased. Last year we hit an all-time high for unemployment, an all-time post-apartheid high for unemployment. And these political disputes, this political violence is played out against the background of massively destabilizing inequality. And perhaps the Marikana massacre or the Marikana strike would not have been the seismic event it was if it wasn't being played out against a fundamentally unstable and unjust and unequal social system. And so what the paper tries to do is put those two features together, the over-reliance on exclusive participation, the over-reliance on formalistic and exclusive labor relations systems and structures, and against the background of massive inequality. And what the paper essentially concludes is that the only hope out of this is really twofold. First of all, if we can, we've got to address inequality. We've got to reimagine the limits of what our economic policy can do. We've got to give the poor more. We've got to tax the rich more. That will make the economy much more stable and much more, and political structures much more able to withstand major political disagreements. But we've also got to be much more tolerant of dissent than we are. If to go outside accepted structures and accepted processes is to court appearing in front of what was essentially on August the 16th a police firing squad, if to dissent is to risk your life, then in the context of a tinderbox of inequality, more state killing, more people being, more protests being shut down, more people being unlawfully or unjustly or unfairly detained, is only going to make the political system much more unstable, much more vulnerable to perhaps populist, revanchist, conservative impulses. It will endanger our constitution and threatens to unravel the settlement that was agreed in 1994. So we've got to be much more tolerant of dissent, and we've got to celebrate and preserve the spaces in which a bunch of miners who are not happy with the way the system treats them can just go to the top of a hill and say, we want to speak to the management, and we're not going to allow what we want to do, what we want to achieve, to be dissipated through the usual channels which are meant to stifle our agency and to stop us from getting what we need. We thought it was extremely important to not just discuss the Marikana massacre, not just discuss the commission that was set up after the Marikana massacre, but to place what happened at Marikana in broader social and political perspective, and to get people talking about what the broader implications are, political, social, economic, and strategic, what the broader implications are of the commission and the massacre in that regard. Unfortunately, one of the many things that the commission failed to do was to put those events in context, to encourage reflection on what the events meant politically, socially, legally, strategically, and that is the failure that this conference is trying in some small measure to correct for. And we hope that if we facilitate conversations about Marikana, if more people are talking about what it means for having a fairer, a more just, a more politically stable society, we can hopefully contribute towards ensuring something like what happened at Marikana never happens again, but certainly to ensure that killings at that scale don't happen for the foreseeable future.